We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom.
Today, the Washington Lawyers Committee honors Rod Boggs for all the committee has done during his 45 years of leadership. In 1971, Rod was hired by Stephen Pollock, who was then chair of the committee. He recalls why the job offer was made.
Rod's commitment and energy to our purposes and his potential, I would say, most significant, of bringing into these legal representations volunteer members of the private bar. And I think I saw in Rod that ability to motivate private lawyers to step up and take these representations.
But there was an incredible potential for engaging law firms and lawyers because of the goodwill and the spirit that infused so many young lawyers at that time to get them to work on civil rights matters and other public interest issues. The main thing that had to be done was to find the right vehicle for engaging them.
In 1972, Congress passed an amendment to the Civil Rights Act making discrimination in the federal workforce against the law.
Suddenly, a whole body of government that had never really been held responsible or accountable for equal employment policies was now open for attack.
The attack on discrimination in the federal workforce was led by Joe Sellers. He's now a partner with Cohen, Milstein, Sellers & Toll, but for 16 years, he led the committee's employment project.
Systematically, the committee undertook investigations, many of which led to litigation. I'm reminded, for instance, of Alfred McKenzie, who was a Tuskegee airman, came back from the war and wanted to work at the government printing office. He was slotted in an unskilled job, even though he had been a highly skilled worker in the military.
After several years in the offset press section and having gone through the process of learning the procedure down there very thoroughly, and then watching people whom I had trained the same process who happened to be white elevated above me, I began to resent it.
He was the leader of a very important case challenging barriers to advancement and placement for printing workers at the government printing office.
The Library of Congress was another agency the committee challenged for denying advancement to people of color. This case was of particular interest to Avis Buchanan. Before she assumed her current position as head of D.C.'s Public Defender Service, she also led the committee's employment project.
My mother had worked at the Library of Congress for years. She had worked there since she had graduated from college in 1957. And in fact, she had applied for a job related to her major, which was French. And the library told her that we don't hire black people in that division.
Similar cases were brought against the State Department on behalf of the black Foreign Service officers, the FBI, NASA. There are probably 20 federal agencies.
It took years to conclude these cases and still more years for the consent decrees to have an impact, but change did come.
The old boy system no longer existed that we had known, and promotions were made to many of the black pressmen. And we now have supervisory positions that are filled by blacks, and that otherwise it would never have happened had it not been for this case.
By 1983, housing discrimination had been against the law for 15 years, yet it was still widespread in the Washington area. That year, Rabbi Bruce Kahn and 5 other clergymen of different faiths became founding board members of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington.
There are 2 words that could sum up the why and the how of the start of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington. Rod Boggs. It was Rod's vision for us to work together with the Lawyers Committee and advance the progress with which fair housing would take hold all through Greater Washington and even beyond Greater Washington, which is what happened.
One example is the case of Carrie Tymas, who sought help from the Fair Housing Council a few years later. She was denied an apartment for her and her son because the William J. Davis Management Company repeatedly lied to her about vacancies. Her case came to the Washington Lawyers Committee shortly after John Relman, who is now a principal in his own civil rights firm, became director of the committee's Fair Housing Project.
Discrimination against families with children was a new area under the Fair Housing Act, and it wasn't yet clear that the courts or that people would understand that discrimination against families with children is as bad and as discriminatory as race discrimination, because so many families with children who rent, disproportionate numbers, are people of color.
Through discovery, the committee's legal team found evidence that the management company had lied. Even so,
William J. Davis still decided to go to trial, and we ended up with a $2.4 million jury verdict. Now, at that time, there had never been a multi-million-dollar jury verdict, and we quickly developed a name at the Washington Lawyers Committee. People really paid attention to what we said because now they were going to get hit in their pocketbooks. There were other places where we expanded fair housing law. We expanded into homeowners insurance. We expanded it in the lending area.
the committee has also been a leader in taking on discrimination in public accommodations.
The first large public accommodations case was against Holiday Spas. This was a company that was a chain of health clubs up and down the East Coast, which we discovered had a practice of discouraging African Americans from becoming members. And it came about because one of the workers there happened to notice on the sign-in sheets that next to certain names were the initials DNWAM. And we called around to the people whose names had that next to them, and they were all African American. It turned out those letters stood for "Do Not Want as Member."
Holiday Spa was also discriminating against African Americans in 5 other East Coast cities. So Rod Boggs launched the committee's first multi-state effort. To the legal team, he recruited local firms that also had offices in each of the 5 cities.
And we had regular conference calls and meetings. It was an extraordinary commitment of resources and a terrific example of teamwork.
The committee also challenged discrimination by many other corporations, including Avis Rent-A-Car. The case against Denny's became a nationwide class action. Our public accommodations cases concluded with large settlements and commitments to a new way of doing business. During its early years, the committee was a leader in advocating for immigrants and refugees who were making our country their home. Judge Vanessa Ruiz recalls these efforts.
The committee has offered a lot of assistance to the many people who flooded to this area in the 70s and 80s as a result of wars and dislocation and just dangerous situations in Central America in particular, and also Africa and in Haiti, and organized legal assistance, pro bono assistance for people who needed help with primarily asylum, but also other immigration issues. The Lawyers Committee does fantastic work. It's not only gone out and searched for those lawyers, but it has trained those lawyers to do that kind of work. It has really led to a much greater understanding in the legal community of what immigration law is about. And I credit the Lawyers Committee and Rod Boggs in particular for spearheading that effort. It's a very, very important work.
The passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991 created a pressing need for a new area of civil rights enforcement, according to Mark Fiedler, who chaired the Disability Rights Council.
Non-compliance with the ADA was widespread. Major corporations with extensive resources had not met their legal obligation to make their goods and services readily accessible to people with disabilities. Rod recognized that right away and promptly initiated the creation of Disability Rights Council of Greater Washington with legal support from the Washington Lawyers Committee and law firms recruited by Rod Boggs. The Disability Rights Council filed dozens of lawsuits against ADA violators. One of our first cases was against the Safeway supermarket chain. The settlement of that case resulted in structural modifications at hundreds of grocery stores throughout the country. Similar results were achieved in many other cases, such as against Burger King. A local bank was required to provide voice-guided ATMs that enable blind customers to bank independently. A movie theater chain was required to install assistive listening systems. The Disability Rights Council's cases ultimately benefited thousands of people with disabilities throughout the country. None of that would have been possible without Rod Boggs, and for that reason, the disability community owes an enormous debt of gratitude to Rod, the man I think of as the intrepid impresario of civil rights litigation.
Ted Howard is pro bono counsel for Wiley Rein. He's also the Washington Lawyers Committee board member who guided the transition of the small, standalone D.C. Prisoners Legal Services project into a major project of the committee. According to him,
it has been hugely advantageous to the cause of prisoners' rights. The Lawyers Committee had a significantly greater network of law firms with which it collaborated on work, and larger law firms that tended to have offices in other jurisdictions around the country. As a result of that, we were suddenly enabled yet again to be in a position to actually help directly those prisoners who were encountering conditions of confinement wherever they happened to be that we regarded as problematic under the Constitution. And that was really the vision that Rod Boggs had in mind. The case that probably comes most readily to mind is the ADX litigation involving the maximum security federal prison in Colorado, where although significant numbers of attorneys from Arnold and Porter's D.C. office have been involved in the case, they have also been able to engage significant numbers of their lawyers in their Denver office and their Los Angeles office to devote time and attention to what is an incredibly significant case involving solitary confinement of severely mentally ill prisoners.
Public education has been a priority for the committee for over 40 years, whether it's adequate funding, parental involvement, or school modernization. In the mid-90s, we began creating partnerships between law firms and public schools. Ben Wilson is a former committee co-chair and managing partner at Beveridge and Diamond. His firm's partnership with Savoy Elementary School is a priority for him.
And the goal is to make certain that we supplement the resources that the schools have, that we encourage academic interest among teachers and students, and we support our teachers and our students in our DC public schools. And I think it's had a very healthy impact.
Now these partnerships are bringing resources to over 50 schools. Law firms provide parent workshops, tutoring, mentoring, coaching, street law classes, and more.
Today, it's one of the programs we're most proud of.
There are features of Rod's leadership that transcend all projects. One is his capacity to involve the private bar in the work of the committee.
Lawyers in the district have been, and their commitment to our work have been the most important attribute leading to our success.
Rod just never found any lawyer who he believed could not be a great civil rights lawyer. And so everybody was a volunteer in Rod's eyes. And that creates enormous enthusiasm, great energy, and tremendous resources. You have a team that's unbeatable. For Rod, there was no limit to this team. This team went on and on and on and on. The draft was endless.
Another feature is his ability to recruit and retain staff.
I grew up at the Washington Lawyers Committee. I was there for almost 16 years, and so much of my professional development occurred while I was at the Washington Lawyers Committee. So Rod's role was invaluable to my development.
I value the 13 years I spent at the Washington Lawyers Committee. I got to be friends with people who truly believed in what they were doing, and I believed in what we were doing as well.
Rod was a believer that, look, you know, if you're smart and if you're committed and if you've got lots of energy, then just go get it. And if you can do it, you can do it. So he put us out there, and he just gave us limitless support in terms of encouragement. Rod was the best boss you could have, bar none.
Rod Boggs is retiring, but discrimination is not even taking the day off. Yet Bruce Kahn is very optimistic about the future of the Washington Lawyers Committee.
Rod Boggs can be the example to follow. And we could say, what would Rod say? What did Rod do? And that we can add our own thoughts and our own insights and our own passions and our own commitments to that and continue to build on his utterly magnificent legacy.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. That which touches me most is that